Everyone. Welcome back. We are picking up our discussion on recurrent neural networks, and more specifically, we'll look at attention, transformers, and exciting topics in modern sort of language modeling and natural language generation and understanding literature. Today, we're lucky to have Arjun with us giving this guest lecture. So Arjun is a PhD student in the School of Interactive Computing in our college. He actually was a researcher for just about a decade before he started his PhD at MIT Lincoln Labs and at Northrop Grumman. He's been doing interesting work in multimodal transformers. So using vision, language, and even agent embodiment action transformers. He'll be talking about that literature towards the end of his lecture today, but we're looking forward to his lecture. So take it over, Arjun.
Okay. Okay. I wanted to start by saying I'm very happy that I'm wearing a different shirt than in that picture. That's one of my favorite shirts, so I'm glad I didn't double up because that would be awkward. Anyway, in today's lecture, I'm going to be talking about this beautiful idea of attention. And we'll see how attention can play into the RNN models that you've seen, and then that'll provide us the basis for these newer natural language processing architectures, transformer and BERT. And then we'll see how we can extend that even further, even beyond natural language processing. But what I'd like you to take away from a high level is that this idea of attention is really powerful. And from a research point of view, I think we've only started to crack the surface of how powerful this idea can be. So I'll show you some really exciting things today, and I think there's even more exciting things to come. So in this class, we've been talking about recurrent neural networks, and you've talked about how they can be used to solve these kind of sequence problems, perhaps sequence-to-sequence problems where we might be doing machine translation, where we want to translate language from one language to another language, like English to French or English to Spanish, and we'll talk about that today. You'll also be seeing in this class other types of applications such as image captioning, where we have a single image and we want to produce a caption that will be a sequence of outputs. And there, recurrent neural networks used to be the way to go about doing that. But what you'll see is also how to do that with transformers that we'll talk about today. Okay, so diving into this a little bit, we'll start with this sequence-to-sequence example. And we'll talk about how we saw doing this with RNNs. So the input here is a sequence of tokens, x1, x2, x3, x4. And in this case, we're going to be producing an output sequence as well, where we're going to want to translate the input sequence from English to Spanish. So we have the input sentence, "We are eating bread," and we're going to want the Spanish translation. The way we do this with the RNNs is we start by encoding the input sentence. And so we use our recurrent neural network to take in the tokens "we are eating bread," and we sequentially process them to produce the hidden states H1, H2, H3, and H4. After we've done this sequential processing, we produce two vectors from this. The first vector is the initial state for our decoder, because we're going to try and decode this sentence, "We are eating bread," into Spanish. And the second vector is what we call a context vector. So this context vector is going to try and capture what the concept is in the input sentence, "We are eating bread." And we're going to feed this context vector at each time step of the decoding process. And this is going to allow us to understand what we're talking about as we decode our output sentence. So in practice, what this looks like is we start by feeding a start token and the context vector. We update actually, one second, I'm going to get a laser pointer here. We update the state of our decoder, and then we produce the first word in our output sequence. And I won't try and pronounce this because I have never taken Spanish, but you can assume that this is how we would start the Spanish translation of this sentence. And then the next step is to do something very similar. We bring this Spanish word down here and use that as input. We again use our context vector. We update our initial, our decoder state, and then we produce the second word in this output. And we can continue this process to produce the entire output translation by passing the input tokens in here and getting the output tokens out here. And this is how we do sequence-to-sequence processing purely with RNNs. Now, the problem with this approach is that we've reused this context vector at each step of the decoding process to produce the next word in our sentence. And to give you an intuition as to what's going on here, what this context vector was trying to capture is all of the information in this input sentence so that we can produce the correct outputs on the right-hand side. And for a small example, like we are eating bread, this might not be too much of a problem because we can imagine capturing the notion of we are eating bread in some fixed size vector representation. And maybe this fixed size vector representation is sufficient for producing an appropriate output. But when we want to start to scale this to longer input sequences, for example, an entire book, the idea that we can encode an entire book into the same fixed size vector starts to become unreasonable. So it becomes unreasonable that we would be able to encode an entire book's content into a single context vector and then produce the decoded translation of that book. And so this context vector represents some bottleneck in our architecture. The main idea that researchers came up with was that what if we were able to use a new context vector at each step of the decoding? For example, in our book example, maybe the context vector would represent the first paragraph of our book, and then we would decode the first paragraph. And then we would get a new context vector that represented the second paragraph, and then we would go on and decode the second paragraph. And this is just a notional example, but this idea of using a different context vector at each step of the decoding process is the core of what we'll be talking about today. So we've talked about how this C is kind of a bottleneck in this architecture, and we'd like to use multiple Cs as we're decoding. And the way we're going to mechanize this is with this mechanism called attention. So the process of encoding is going to work quite similarly. We're going to encode our input sequence into a hidden state representation. We're going to project that into an initial decoder state. But now we're going to use this initial decoder state in a different way. And specifically, we're going to use it with this concept called attention. So to start with, what we're going to do is we're going to compare this initial decoder state with each of the hidden vector representations of each of our words. So we're going to compare this hidden state as 0 with H1, H2, H3, and H4. And in this comparison, we're essentially going to come up with an alignment score. How aligned is this initial decoder state to each of these vectors? And that's going to produce these alignment scores, E11, E12, E13, E14, that will represent this alignment. The way we're going to generate the alignment score is through this small neural network, FAT, which is just going to be a simple MLP that takes in these two inputs, the S and the H vectors, and produces this output, which is going to be a scalar value that represents how closely these two words are aligned. And intuitively, what you can think about is that perhaps this initial decoder state wants to represent the beginning of the sentence. And so it should be aligned to the beginning of these hidden vectors. So maybe it's aligned to the word we here. And then you'll get a high alignment score here in E11 and lower alignment scores in the remaining values. Then we're going to apply a softmax operation to turn these unnormalized scores into normalized probabilities, meaning that each of these probability values will range from 0 to 1, and we can sum them up and get 1. And the reason we're doing this is that the next step is we're going to apply a weighted sum of these attention scores to produce our context vector. So specifically, what we're going to do is we're going to use this attention probability A11 to weight the input vector H1. Similarly, we'll use A12 to weight the input vector H2. And we'll do this by just computing the multiplication between these two values. And once we do this with all of our attention scores, we're going to sum them up and produce a new context vector, C1. So what's happened here is that we've produced this alignment score that perhaps attended to this word we, because that's the beginning of the sentence. And so it took a lot of this vector H1 and put it into the context vector. And it took smaller amounts of H2, H3, and H4 and also put them into the context vector. And so what you can imagine is that this context vector now represents the beginning of the sentence rather than the global context that represented the entire sentence. We're going to use this context vector in the same way that we did previously. So we'll use the context vector along with a start token to produce S1, which is our updated hidden state. And we'll use that to produce the first word in our sentence. But now the difference is that this context vector had attended to the beginning of the sentence. And so it was maybe easier to produce the first word in the sentence. The next thing, the thing that's important to understand here is that all of the operations that I described in producing these attention weights are all just matrix multiplications or this softmax function, which you've seen before. And we know that all of these functions are differentiable. So you've seen in this class how you can differentiate through a computational graph that contains all of these operations. And so the point here is that we can train this network by simply training it to produce the correct outputs, back propagating derivatives through this computational graph, and we no longer need to supervise the attention weights at this intermediate stage in the network. So this would be a painful thing if for each English and Spanish sentence, we had to align each of the words and provide ground truth labels for how each of the words align towards in the input sentence. But we're not going to do any of that. Instead, we're just going to use backpropagation and let the network learn how to apply attention in whatever way is useful for decoding the sentence. To give you a bit of an intuition about what kind of like very made up numbers might be for the attention, the first word in the Spanish sentence corresponds to the two words we are. And so attention might put a weight of 0.45 and 0.45 on the first two words and very small attention on the next two words. And this is how we might apply attention here. But just to be clear, these values are entirely made up, and the network is going to learn how to apply these values. And we've just given it the machinery to attend over different parts of the input. For the next step in the sequence, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to take S1 now and use S1 to compute our attention scores. And remember, S1 captures some information about what we've already decoded in our decoder RNN. And now, given this information about what we've already encoded, we're going to go look back at the input, and perhaps we're going to find the next word that we need to decode in the output sentence. And we're going to follow the same attention process to produce C2, and we're going to use C2 along with the input token to produce the next word in the output. So if we play this whole thing out, we're going to get different C values, and each of those are going to yield different internal state S1, S2, S3, and S4, and we're going to use those to decode our output Spanish sentence. The point here is we've gotten rid of that bottleneck. We used to have a bottleneck here of a single global context vector, and now we have these local context vectors that attend to different parts of the input, essentially looking at different parts of the input when they're producing their corresponding part of the output. One of the nice things that is a consequence of applying attention in this way is that it gives us a way of visualizing what is going on under the hood of this recurrent neural network model. So specifically what we have a sense of is we can view these attention scores or these attention scalar values in this kind of matrix that you see here on the right. And whenever there's a high attention weight, we can infer that the model was using a corresponding word in this input sentence to produce the output sentence. So very specifically, here the example is showing an English to French translation. You see the input and the output over here. In this attention matrix here, the input is along the top and the corresponding output is along the left-hand side. And whenever there is an attention score, each row represents the attention that was placed at that step of the processing. So this is the A11 value and A12, etc. This is A21, A22, etc. So each row here represents a step in our decoding process. There's some interesting things that manifest in this visualization of the attention. Specifically, we see two different structures that have emerged. The first structure is this diagonal structure, which represents that the word la in the French decoded output was attending to the word the in the input sentence. And when the attention occurs along the diagonal, it means that there's a one-to-one correspondence between the order that the words occurred in English and the order that they are being decoded in French. So la corresponds with the, accord corresponds with agreement, and sur corresponds with on. So the idea here is that when the decoder was producing this word, it was attending to the word on. And I'll point out that this just naturally emerged from training the model with the structure that I've described. There was no strong supervision saying that these two words are aligned. This alignment was just learned. The second emergent property here is that our model learns to reorder some of the words, produce the French output translation. So the words economic, European Economic Area are apparently need to be reversed in French. And it looks like the word zone and economic and European correspond with these words. But you can look at the attention and you can see the attention has attended to these words in reverse order to produce a reverse output in the French side. And if anybody is familiar with French, they can let us know whether or not this is the correct translation order. But this is the behavior that this model has learned. Okay, so just to recap this kind of thing at a high level, we've seen how this idea of attending to different parts of the input could be useful for decoding an output. And we've seen that it has these nice properties of interpretability that just emerge naturally. We've looked at this specifically in the context of machine translation, where we're translating from one language to another. But this idea of attending to parts of an input when we're producing an output is something that we can imagine applying to other applications in other contexts. And in fact, this is what researchers wanted to do. For example, we want to apply the idea of attention in image captioning. So if we have an image of a cat and a dog and we want to produce some caption about the cat and the dog, we might want to attend first to the cat, talk about the cat, and then attend to the dog and talk about the dog. And so you can imagine that we not only want to use attention in language-only tasks, but we want to use it more generally everywhere. This motivates producing what we're going to do, the next step, which is we're going to generalize the attention mechanism that I just described into a generic attention layer that we can then apply, of course, in a natural language processing context, but eventually in this lecture, we'll see how we can apply it in many different applications. So what I've done here is just rewrite, or what I'm showing here is just a rewritten version of the discussion we just had. So we had a state vector, S0. We had hidden vectors, H1, H2, H3, and H4. And then we did this computation where we computed similarity scores, we used this softmax operation, and then we computed a linear summation of these things to produce our C1 vector. And so I've just kind of rewritten things to look like this. After this, in order to produce our more generalized attention layer, we're going to change a couple of the steps here in what is hopefully intuitive manner, and then we'll get our generic attention layer. So the first step we're going to do is we're going to rename the input vectors here. So rather than calling this the initial decoder state, we're just going to call this a query vector. So the idea is that this query vector is going to go query each of the H values, and it's going to say, hey, am I similar to you? And we're going to produce a score that represents the answer to that question. And similarly, we'll do that for H2, H3, and H4. And so this is we're going to call this a query vector. And rather than calling these hidden states, we want to make this more generic. So we're just going to call these input vectors, H1, H2, and H3. We're going to rename them input vectors X. So all I've done here is rename the vectors. So just to recap, we have these newly named query and input vectors, and we still have this similarity function f@, which is just an MLP that learns how to compute the similarity between our query and input vectors. As Drew alluded to earlier, the first thing we're going to do is replace that learned similarity score with the dot product. So the dot product between two vectors is this natural way of computing the similarity between these two vectors. And now we don't have to learn how to compute this function of similarity. We can just apply the dot product and get a similarity score without any learned parameters. So this is a nice modification that we'll make here. In practice, what we actually do is use a scaled dot product. The scaling is that we specifically divide the dot product by the square root of the dimensionality of our input vector. And the intuition here is that eventually we're going to pass these alignment scores into a softmax. And if these alignment scores get to be too big, then the gradients through our softmax are going to eventually vanish. And so we divide by the square root to keep these values small. And we use the dimensionality of Q because this dot product scales with the square root of the dimensionality. So this is a nice little trick to get nicely behaved gradients through our attention layer. The next thing we're going to do is, in this example, we had a single query vector, S0 or S1, S2, S3, etc. In general applications, we might want to have many query vectors at the same time. So we might want to query our input many different times, and correspondingly, we might want to produce many outputs, one for each of our queries. The nice thing about this is that the mathematics of this simple multiplication you can see here to produce our dot product. So this is a simple generalization to go to NQ number of query vectors instead of NQ equal to 1 or one single query vector. The next thing we're going to do is observe how our input is used in this computation. So our input vectors are used in two different places in this computation down here. It's used once to compute these similarity scores, and then it's used again down here in the bottom to produce our outputs. So in the outputs, we're using the weighted sum of the attention values to produce our outputs. And here we're using the dot product between our input and our query to produce similarity scores. And the next generalization is simply to disentangle these two operations so that the network has the freedom to do different things at these different points in the calculation. The way we're going to do that is we're going to transform our input vector into two different vectors, a key vector and a value vector. We're going to do this with simply learning these key matrices and this value matrix, and we're just going to do a matrix multiplication here to transform our input vectors X into key vectors and value vectors. And now down here in the computation at the bottom, we're going to use our key vectors to compute similarities, and we're going to use our value vectors to produce our outputs. So we've basically separated these two things in our computation. The intuition for doing this is that we might want to use different types of information to get the keys or compute the similarities than we do want to output from the output of this operation. So you can think of the keys as essentially like performing this lookup function where it's going to allow us to look up what information we need. And then the values are going to be the actual information that we're going to return from the operation. So the key is going to be like our lookup, and the value is going to be the output from that. Okay, so now that we have this like kind of more generic version of attention, we're going to walk through visually how the computation flows. And what I'll mention is that this is exactly the same as the RNN case, except we're now going to have multiple queries, and we're going to apply them to these input vectors x1, x2, and x3. And we're going to use this idea of key and value to separate these operations out. So the computational flow is going to be, first, we're going to take our input vectors x1, x2, and x3. We're going to transform them into key vectors, k1 through 3. And then we're going to compute our scale dot product similarity between our keys and our queries. And this is going to produce this alignment matrix, which is our same E11 values that we saw before. These are unnormalized alignment scores, but now they were produced with this scale dot product between the keys and queries, as opposed to what we saw earlier. Similar to before, we're going to perform a softmax operation on these alignment scores. And here we're taking the softmax along the columns of these matrices to produce attention weights that are going to be probability distributions along the columns as well. We're going to do that value transformation of our input vectors to produce a set of value vectors up here. And then we're going to use these value vectors along with our attention weights to produce our output. Specifically, we're going to multiply V1 with A11, V2 with A12, V3 with A13, and then we're going to sum along the column to produce Y1. We'll do a similar mathematical operation to produce Y2, Y3, and Y4. So the nice thing about this is that we've done very similar computations, but we've done it in this slightly more generalized way, where we've split up this process of these aspects of keys and values, and we've generalized to using more queries than we were using before. There's one thing that is a little bit of a problem with this attention layer as we've described. So in a normal neural network layer, you have some input, and you use that input to produce a corresponding output. But in this case, what we have is two inputs. We have an input vector x's, and we have a query vector q's. And we're using these two inputs to produce a single output. So there's a little bit of a mismatch between this structure that I'm showing here and the typical neural network layer that we're used to seeing. To resolve this dissimilarity, what we're going to do is produce a self-attention layer. Now, in this step, I mentioned here that we have two inputs and we are producing one output. And what we'd like to have is a neural network layer that has one input corresponding with one output. And so that's what we call this self-attention layer. And what we've done here is we've added another query matrix that's going to transform our input vector x into the query values that we need to perform this attention operation. So what this looks like visually is that we're going to use these input values x to produce each of our query vectors q1, q2, and q3. So these query vectors are no longer going to be provided to us. We're going to generate them ourselves using this learned matrix WQ. And then the rest of our computation follows exactly the same as it did previously. We're going to produce key vectors using our input x. We're going to compute similarity scores between the keys and the queries. We're going to use a softmax to produce attention weights. We're going to produce value vectors from our input. And then we're going to use the product of our values and our attention weights to produce our output Y1, Y2, and Y3. So the main thing that we've changed here is that we're now going to learn how to produce queries ourselves. And intuitively, what you can imagine going on here is that X1 has now produced a query Q1 for itself. And And we're going to apply that query to attend over the other values, the other keys in the input. So Q1 is compared to key 1, 2, and 3. And so in a sense, this query is going to be attending over the other values in our input vector. And so this is why this operation or this layer is named a self-attention layer. We're essentially producing queries that allow us to gather information about the other input vectors in our sentence. In our input. And to give you a concrete example, if these were words in a sentence, the first word in the sentence was going to be gathering information about what words occurred later on in the sentence. And that in that way, this first word can develop a contextual understanding of what the sentence is all about and what that specific word means in the context of the other words around it.
Actually, that last point right there, could you expand on that a bit? Because some of the questions we're receiving are of the fact that can you give us some, because this is getting, rightfully so, this is getting abstract, because you're trying to define an abstract layer where X is input, we are going to generate something called a key, something called a query, something called a value. We're going to compare keys to queries. We're going to use those to compute attention weights, and then we're going to use them to sum up values. That as an abstract layer, as a mathematical operation, makes sense. It's a formally defined mathematical operation. I think where some people might struggle is, okay, but can you tell me in a particular application how I should think of what a key should be versus what a query should be? So in language modeling or machine translation or anything else, what should I think of as what does a key represent? What does a query represent? What does a value represent?
Right. So when in the context of natural language, as an example, each of these input elements could represent a different word. So X1, X2, X3 can be different words in a sentence. And maybe these words represent the sentence, the dog fetched the bone. And in that sentence, we have different words like dog, fetch, and bone. And at the input stage, all these words know is what word they are themselves. So they only have an understanding of their own content or what the individual word is. By producing queries, the word can ask for other information about other words in the sentence. The keys simply represent like your indexing. So the keys represent some representation of what word I am, and the query can represent words that like a query about what other information I want to gather. So the word fetched might be wondering what the dog was fetching. And so it might ask some query about that could gather information about the fact that the dog was fetching a bone. Similarly, the values could represent what the information is that needs to be returned. So in this example, the word fetch would produce a query that says, what is the dog fetching? It would get matched up to the word bone that would then return some value that represents the word bone. And now on the output side, the word fetch cannot just know about itself, but it can know something about the context of the sentence in the fact that, okay, the fetch is going to then refer to this concept of bone. And I'm going to apologize actually in advance. I think if I was a natural language processing expert, I would have produced a better example on the fly of that. But that was the example that I could come up with.
No, I think that helped a lot. And one thing I would add to that explanation is if you remember the language modeling lecture from last time, right? We were reading in one character at a time. We could read in one word at a time. And what we were trying to make an argument of is that the hidden vector h sub t, whether that be capital T or little t, h sub t at time t is compressing all information about the characters or words you have seen so far. And some of you had asked the question, well, why are we operating left to right? Why can't we operate right to left? And my answer last lecture was yes, there are these things called bidirectional RNNs where you can have one RNN going left to right, one going right to left, and then you can concatenate the hidden representations from the right and the left. This particular layer naturally is looking at the entire sentence in context. So x1, x2, x3 is read entirely all at once. X1 generates a representation for a query and also for a key. You do all pairwise comparisons, which give you similarity scores or as output of that softmax, which you're then using to pool representations from all of the values v1, v2, v3s. So by the time you get from x1 to y1, you have generated a representation of this word or this character that incorporates similarity and representations of all other words in the sentence. And so the model can learn what a word in the context of these other words is trying to represent. It could represent things about grammar. It could represent things about parts of speech. It could represent things about semantics, what a word is supposed to denote, and what listener is supposed to do with this word. So this is a way of taking a batch of input representations and computing a batch of output representations by mixing and matching representations for everything in between. So that's point number one. One other thing I will say is that this entire intuition that we are constructing for, that Arjun, the example that Arjun gave, the dog fetched the bone, and maybe the fetch word is trying to figure out who fetched and what was fetched. That's all post hoc rationalization. We do not know if that's what actually happens in these models. We are just trying to think of this as inductive biases. We're trying to come up with layers that enable certain processes to emerge, should that be an optimal or a useful thing to emerge. Okay, back to you, Arjun.
Yeah. So one interesting thought experiment is what happens when we permute these values. So rather than passing in x1, x2, x3, we're now going to pass them in as x3, x1, and x2. When we permute these, it turns out that the query vectors and the key vectors stay exactly the same because they're just a simple matrix multiplication, but they get permuted in order. So now we have Q1 or Q3, Q1, Q2, and K2, K1, K3. These are written in reverse order, so I guess you should read them bottom to top. We get the same similarity scores, but they're also permuted. We get the same attention weights, but again, they're permuted. We get the same values permuted, and the result is that our output is exactly the same, except it's permuted in the exact same order as the input. We call this property of this self-attention layer permutation equivariance. So the term equivariance means that if we apply some permutation on the input, we're going to get the corresponding permutation on the output. And if you work through the math of this, you'll see exactly why this happens. But the simple idea is that if we just shuffle the order down here at the bottom, we'll get the same values out at the top, but the values will be shuffled in order exactly as we did at the bottom. Okay, so the point we just made about permutation equivariance is that the self-attention layer itself doesn't understand anything about the order in which these values occurred. And in some applications, this might be nice, but in the application of natural language processing, the order of the words matters a lot. So in practice, we want to get back this idea of having words come in some order. And in practice, the way we do this is we add some positional encodings. We concatenate these encodings to the input vectors, and we use these positional encodings to capture information about which order each of these x1, x2, and x3 occur in the original sentence or data that we're processing. There are many ways to do these positional encodings, and you can look them up if you're interested, but the intuition here is that E1 is just going to simply say I'm the first element in the sequence, E2 is going to say I'm the second, and E3 is going to say I'm the third. And now, if it's useful for the model to keep track of the order of these values, then that ordering information will be maintained through the output of the network. There's a couple other variations that are useful to talk about. One of them is this idea of a masked self-attention layer. The idea of masked self-attention goes back to the decoder that we were discussing before. In the decoder, we pass a start token and we produce the first word in our sentence. And then we pass that word down at the bottom and we produce the next word in our sentence. In the generic attention layer, we were attending over all of the words equally, and we didn't know which, we were attending over words that came in the future and words that came in the past. The idea of masking simply is that we are going to put infinities into this alignment score matrix anywhere where the alignment score would require looking into the future to figure out the similarity score here. So for example, to figure out this alignment score right here, the word start would have to look at the word big, and that would be looking into the future. And so we're just going to assign that a negative infinity. When we apply the softmax function, this results in an attention score of 0. So start gets an attention score of 0 on big and cat. And so consequently, it's not able to look into the future. Another variation that occurs in practice is this idea of multi-head self-attention. And in the interest of time, I won't go into the details of this. But essentially what we're doing is we're applying H independent attention heads over our input, and then we're going to concatenate the output. So what we've seen is 3 different ways of processing sequences. The first way that we talked about was recurrent neural networks. And these are nice because we're able to process these long sequences, and it handles this sequential processing problem that we ran into. But the challenge is that these are not parallelizable. So we have to process the values in order, and so we can't produce, Y4 until we've produced Y3. We can't produce Y3 until we've produced Y2. We can't produce Y2 until we've produced Y1. And so it's difficult to parallelize this operation on a GPU or other computational hardware. Another thing we could do to process sequences is actually use convolutional neural networks. And here we can use a 1D convolution and scan that convolution over our input sequence, and we could use that to produce output. The challenge here is that this is not great for long sequences because we have to, our convolutional kernel has some width. And in order to look at the entire sentence, we're going to need to stack many layers of convolution so that we have a receptive field that looks at the entire input sentence. But the nice thing about using convolutions is that it's a highly parallelizable operation. And so we might want to do this if we want to compute, process this input in parallel. The last thing we looked at was this idea of a self-attention layer. The nice thing was that we could look at the entire input when we're computing our self-attention. So we didn't have the challenge of the convolutional neural network. And it was a highly parallel operation because we're simply performing these matrix multiplications, which can be parallelized on GPU hardware. There's a small downside, which is that these are very memory intensive, but the solution there is to buy a more expensive GPU with a larger memory footprint.
Arjun?
Yep.
We received a question which might be broadly useful. In multi-headed attention, why don't all attention heads lead to the same processing? Like, why are they different?
Yeah, so the intuition there is that imagine a case where there's 2 different parts of the input that need to be attended to. If we had a single head of attention, it would need to apply equal weighting to these 2 parts of the input. If this occurs in practice, with multi-headed attention, what the network could learn, if this is an important situation, it could learn to have one attention head specialized to the beginning of the input sequence, and the other attention head, for example, specialized to the end of the input sequence. And then instead of having to have one attention mechanism that attends to both parts of the sequence, it could have one of these that attend to the beginning and one that attend to the end. This is a very generic example, This may not happen in practice at all, but this idea of being able to attend to different aspects or different components of the input is the freedom that we get from having this multi-headed attention. So it's simply giving the network a little bit more freedom to do this processing in a more specialized way.
And maybe an analog here is multiple convolution filters, right? So one filter can look for a particular type of input and another filter can look for another. Structurally, it is the same operation, but you end up computing different things because the parameters are different. And so here, the keys and the queries and the values that will be produced are all different because their parameters are different.
Yeah, and that's a consequence of the random initialization. So we have these three different ways of processing sequences. And what you'll recall is that the first way that we talked about was combining recurrent neural networks with an attention mechanism to process the sequential data. And I suggested to you that this was a good way to do it. But when you're solving a new sequential processing problem, you still have to decide which of these methods you're going to use, or if you're going to combine different methods, as we saw earlier on in this lecture. So researchers were struggling with this question about which of these methods we have to learn. And there's this very seminal paper from 2017 that explored this idea of simply using attention to solve this entire task. And they have a very nice title for their paper, which is Attention is All You Need. And really this paper is about, can we use attention and attention only to solve this task? And it turns out that this is a very powerful idea and has led to a lot of breakthroughs in natural language processing, as we'll show shortly. The way they went about doing this is that they constructed what's called a transformer block that builds upon this self-attention layer that I've described previously. So we have our input tokens, x1, x2, x3. The first thing we're going to do in our transformer block is we're going to apply self-attention. We're going to add a residual connection so that there's better gradient flow through our block. And then we're going to apply this layer normalization. If you're familiar with batch normalization, this is a similar operation. But the idea or the high-level intuition is that adding normalization in the middle of our neural network layers typically helps regularize these networks and helps the learning objective. After the layer normalization, we're going to add a bunch of independent MLP heads that are going to just transform each of these tokens. And this is simply going to add a little bit of flexibility to allow this block to perform a little bit of additional computation on each of the tokens independently. We're going to add another residual connection and a layer normalization. And that final layer normalization is going to produce our output. So this block of computation is what was introduced in this Attention is All You Need paper as a transformer block that essentially takes some input, x1, x2, and x3, and transforms it through this series of operations into y1, y2, y3. And the main workhorse of this transformation is this self-attention layer that attends over all the tokens in our input, produces some contextualized representation, as we've been talking about, of these input values that'll be represented in y1, y2, y3. And like we've mentioned, this is a highly parallelizable operation, and that's why it's it was a nice model. And in this paper, essentially what they show is the power of this relatively simple series of operations. They show that if you stack these transformer blocks, you can essentially get a very, very powerful sequence processing model using basically just this attention mechanism. I'm covering these details very quickly, so I'll refer you back to the paper. The paper is a very nice read, so if you're interested in the details of this, I highly suggest going to that paper. One of the things I love about the paper is this diagram. It's an absolutely beautiful picture of their full architecture. And if you guys write papers, add pretty pictures like this because it makes the papers really fun to read. I won't go into the details of this full transformer architecture that they introduced in this paper, But on the left-hand side, what you see is that transformer block that I just described. Instead of general self-attention, we're going to use the multi-head self-attention. But otherwise, this is the same transformer block that I just described. They put this transformer block into an encoder-decoder architecture. And this is, intuitively very similar to the encoder-decoder architecture that we saw with RNNs, where the encoder's job was to encode the input in some way, and the decoder's job was to sequentially produce each of the output words. So if we're translating English to Spanish, the decoder is producing each of the Spanish words. And those specialized layers like the masked multi-head attention falls in right here, and there's another specialized layer here. But in the interest of time, I am not going to go into the details of those. The next generalization of this was in the BERT architecture. And here, again, I won't go into the details, but what the BERT architecture said, the core contribution, is let's get rid of this complex detector decoder that you see here on the right, and let's just use the encoder to transform our input representation from some text that has no understanding of the words around it to text that has a very coherent understanding of all the words around it. And the way they did that is they simply stacked these encoder blocks into a series to produce the BERT model, which is just this series of encoders stacked up in a row. The other key contribution of this paper is a way to train these BERT models on a massive unsupervised data set. So they developed these two training objectives that don't require a human to label your text data in any way, and allows us to train these models to transform text from a sequence of words into a contextual representation of those words that are useful for a lot of different tasks. And Ishan will probably talk about the broader scope of self-supervised learning next week, but these masked language modeling and next sentence prediction losses do play into how this field has evolved. Just very briefly, the masked language modeling loss works like a fill-in-the-blank task. So you take your input text, you mask out some word in the input text, and you encourage the model to be able to predict that word at the end of your sequence. So if you have some sentence like we talked about before, where the dog fetched the bone, if I mask out the word bone, the model is going to have to predict what word comes after the dog fetched and you have to fill in that blank. Similarly, the next sentence prediction loss does another unsupervised learning task, but I won't go into the details here.
Arjun, actually, we have a question about something that came before this, and it was about what part of the transformer was a decoder, because I think that wasn't very clear in this figure. So could you comment on that again?
Yeah, so the right-hand side of this figure is the decoder block, and it has a couple additional things added to the generic transformer block that you see on the left. So the first additional thing is that it performs this masked multi-head attention. So the decoder is trying to produce individual words in the output. So it can't look at future words when it's producing its output tokens. So we have to use that masked multi-head attention layer that I described earlier so that we don't get to look ahead in the output when we're decoding the output. The other thing that it has, which is special, is this multi-head attention that uses query values from the decoder. So this is query values that represent what words we've currently decoded in the sentence, and key and value vectors from the encoder. So this step right here is graphically trying to depict using queries from the sentence that we've currently decoded and going back to the input and asking what parts of the input are relevant for us to decode the next word in the sequence. So at a very high level, that's what makes the decoder a little different. Okay, skipping forward, I won't go into the details, but it turns out that this BERT model has set a lot of top performances on different benchmarks. Specifically on this benchmark, the thing to note is that Mac, Albert, struct Albert, Albert, and Ernie, and all these things are variations of this attention-based modeling paradigm. And importantly, on these benchmarks, all of these methods have started to surpass this human baseline. So much so that these researchers developed a new benchmark called superglue so that humans could retake the top place in the leaderboard. I won't go into an example because we have only a few minutes left. What I'll do is explain one additional concept that I'd like you to take away from this lecture, which is that we've talked about attention-based processing in the context of natural language processing. But as researchers, the question we asked was, can we use this concept of attention to process more than just text? And it turns out some work out of Georgia Tech addressed this question to develop this model called Wilbur, which is designed to process both image and language data. And the way they went about doing this is they developed the Wilbert architecture by starting with the BERT model that I described that does a nice job of processing language data. And then to process the visual input, they ran, this is an image, they ran an off-the-shelf object detector to detect regions in the image. And then the key idea here is that we're going to treat each of the regions detected in the image as visual tokens. So you can imagine that we have some image of a cat and a dog. We detect the cat and the dog. And now the region in the image corresponding to a cat is one of our visual tokens. And the region in the image corresponding to the dog is another one of our visual tokens. And now that we have the vision data in this token space, we can now apply this attention-based mechanism to process the vision input in the exact same way as the language input. And so this model called Wilbert is just really exciting. And I don't think I have time to talk about the details of this, but it's just a prelude to how this idea of attention can be extended to not just textual processing, but text and image processing. So I'll jump through kind of the slides I had left and leave you with the summary that I wish I would have gotten through, but this is the gist of what we kind of talked about.
Okay, thank you, Arjun. So what we typically do is we stop introducing new material on time, but I usually hang around and answer questions. And so in the meantime, so people can feel free to log off at this point. We will not be introducing new material, but Arjun, if you were planning to run through the Wilbert demo, you could do that now while we wait for questions and answer them.
Cool. So here's a demo of that vision and language model that we had. And what you can do with this demo is you can select any of these images.
Just a heads up, Arjun, you're not sharing your screen anymore.
Sorry about that. Okay, so in this demo, you can select any of these images right here, and you can process these images with Wilbert. And the way this works is that we have an image here, and Wilbert is a language and vision model. So you can solve a bunch of different language and vision tasks, such as visual question answering. So what I can do here is I can take this image and I can start to ask questions about it, and Wilbert will produce the answers to my question. So I can ask, what is the person doing? And Wilbert will respond with, the person is pitching, which is correct. I can change that query to say, what is in the person's hand? And again, Wilbert is going to respond with baseball, ball, and glove, which is pretty neat because that's what's in each of the hands of this baseball player. I can ask more complicated questions like, who is in the background? And the model responds with fans, spectators, and people. And this is pretty neat because I do see some fans, and I guess they're people, and they're definitely spectators. And one of the interesting things I found about this model is if you change the language a little bit, like I say, who is the person in the background? Now I want a specific individual person in here. The model now changes its answer to say there's an umpire as well as the fans and spectator. And if you can't see it, there's an umpire standing right here. And so this model has learned these kind of very intricate mappings between the visual input over here and this language input over here on the right-hand side.
And just to be a bit more explicit, there are bounding boxes that are being extracted from this image that we are not showing in this demo, right? There's maybe, 300 bounding boxes and features corresponding to them from a CNN that are fed as input to the first layer of the vision stream in lbert.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question. Was the image data part annotated or only the object detection algorithm before lbert was used to do this? So I guess the question is asking, is the image annotated at all, or is just the detector supervised during training time?
Yeah, so I think this picture kind of explains this question. So we take a pre-trained detector. So that detector has been supervised to detect objects in the scene. But that's not enough, because all this detector knows how to do is process an image and detect different interesting bounding boxes in the scene. It doesn't have any concept of the language that needs to be aligned with the different regions in the image. And so the way we accomplish that alignment between the detected boxes and the language is by pre-training lbert on a massive vision and language corpora from this conceptual captions dataset. So this dataset contains 3.3 million images and their corresponding captions that were automatically generated from web data. So people apply alt text to these images, and some researchers produce captions from that. So we semi-automatically produce captions corresponding with images, and we're going to use these image caption pairs to pre-train lbert. And we're going to do that by following that fill in the blank task that I talked about before. So for example, if I mask out the part of this image that contained the blue sofa, what the network has to learn is the correspondence between the text that says blue sofa in a living room to predict that there was a blue sofa here. So, by solving this prediction task or fill in the blank, the model learns these alignments between the bounding box regions and the text, and we use that to solve this problem.